Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. My guest today is Paul Collier, professor of economics at Oxford University, director of the Center for the Study of African Economies, and the author of The Bottom Billion, Why the Poorest Countries Are Failing and What Can Be Done About It. Paul, welcome to EconTalk.
Thanks very much for inviting me.
Who are the bottom billion, and where are they?
Well, they're a group of countries which add up to about 1 billion people. There are nearly 60 of them. They're drawn from all the regions of the world, but they're disproportionately drawn from Africa. About 70% of the bottom billion people are living in Africa. And the distinctive feature of these 60-odd countries is that, for various reasons, they've failed to grow over the period since their independence. Most developing countries have grown, and for one reason or other, these miss the boat. And so the overarching characteristic of them is of economic stagnation.
And there's, as you say, there's about 60. And these bottom billion folks aren't just 60 nations where these people are found. And these folks aren't just not doing as well as others. It's not just, they are not doing as well as others, but it's not just their relative station that we're talking about. It's the absolute situation they're in.
They're in absolute poverty. Some of them have actually been in decline. But I do think that the key feature is really one of divergence from the rest of mankind. I mean, even if we dismiss the billion rich folk in the world, people like you and me who are living in countries that have already sort of made it to high income level, and that is 1 billion people. If we just compare the billion at the bottom with the 4 billion people living in other developing countries, what happened over that 40-year period since independence was a growing and accelerating divergence, so that by the millennium, the gap between the typical citizen of the bottom billion and the typical citizen of the next 4 billion had widened to 5 to 1. So even before we look at the rich world, this was a yawning gap. And it's been widening for the last 20 years at around 5% a year, just between the bottom billion and the next 4 billion.
And that's
so it's stagnation and divergence.
And that widening is occurring because they're stagnating in the bottom, and the middle 4 are in nations that are growing either well or quite well.
Yes, and so I emphasize that because when I was a student, which is quite a long time ago, we tended to think of the sort of the development problem as kind of everybody except ourselves, kind of everybody except the rich countries, 5 billion poor people in developing countries and 1 billion rich. And that was a sensible way of looking at things 30 years ago, but it's not now. Most of the developing world is actually developing pretty fast. China and India are converging on the rich world at rates that are just historically unprecedented, quite amazing. And so even though they're still poor, they won't stay poor. A lot of other developing countries have already made it to middle income status, so a country like Malaysia. And so the challenge for development now is no longer a world of 5 billion people in developing countries. It's this billion at the bottom. It's trying to get these countries out of this stagnation that has persisted for so long.
And in trying to understand this stagnation, you identify 4 traps that nations that have these folks in them suffer from it. And I should mention before we go on that, of course, within these 58 nations, there are some extraordinarily wealthy people. It's just that there are very, very few of them. That's an insight I first heard from R.E.A. Hillman. So it's the poor people in those nations we want to help, but they've got 4 traps that keep them poor. Tell us what those are.
Yes, I mean, there are probably other traps. I don't want to be sort of ideological about them, but I think that 4 big traps are the things that are doing the real damage. And it's moving away from the notion that there is a single explanation, rather to saying that there are only 4, that I think is the sort of the major step in the diagnosis of the book, which is new. I mean, I just back up and say the book is really in 3 stages. There's a problem definition, which we've just talked about, which is this problem of divergence of the people at the bottom. There's a diagnosis, which is about the traps. And then finally there's prescription. And the essence of diagnosis is to move away from big picture single explanations. So I home in on these 4, and I wouldn't rule out that there are others, but the big 4, one is conflict, which is basically comes down to civil war, coups, political violence. And that is both devastating for development, it's development in reverse, and it's also a trap because, first of all, once you stumble into these internal conflicts, they're highly persistent. And secondly, even when you come out of them, there's a high risk of going back into them.
And they're extremely common, which is one of the most depressing and enlightening parts of the book for me. Talk about how common they are in these 58 or so countries.
Yes, I mean and in some areas they're actually becoming more common. That if you go back to Africa in the 1970s, the incidence of sort of large-scale violence was pretty low, and then it built up to really a crescendo in the 1990s. Since the end of the Cold War, there's been some easing off, but not a lot. Political violence is still, in its various manifestations, is still an ugly reality in a lot of the bottom billion societies. We've
got it going right now in Kenya.
Exactly. I mean, the transition from dictatorship to electoral competition or democracy, which we had hoped would deliver peace, has actually tended to escalate the degree of political violence. And so the sheer intractable nature of these problems of conflict, I think, has been underestimated.
Okay, well, I'm going to come back to that, but that's the first trap, is the conflict trap. Give us the other 3.
Yes, the second trap, which in a way shouldn't be a trap at all, is having a lot of natural resources, valuable natural resources like oil. And that's a paradox because, of course, it should be an opportunity. It should be great news.
It's
the
gravy.
Revenues from oil and diamonds and so on are sort of dwarf aid inflows, and so this should be powering development forward. But all too often, it isn't. It actually corrodes and corrupts the politics. And so even where it doesn't turn the society into violence, it produces a massively dysfunctional polity in which the political leaders, instead of supplying the public goods that the society needs, conduct a contest with each other to control the public purse. The public purse becomes a sort of tragedy of the commons in which different groups compete to control it rather than the source of national public goods for the society. So that's the second trap. The third trap is very different. It's being landlocked without natural resources. If you're landlocked without natural resources, your options for development are really pretty limited. If you've got natural resources and you're landlocked, at least potentially you can make good use of those resources, and a country like Botswana has done so. But if you're landlocked without natural resources, what do? You can't easily export goods because you can't reach the coast. You don't even control the route to the coast. That depends upon your more fortunate neighbors. And so around the world, the landlocked resource-scarce countries are the most impoverished and the slowest growing. It's particularly a problem for Africa. If we look outside Africa, only about 1% of the world's developing population lives in such countries. But within Africa, it's about a third of the population. Another way of saying that is that outside Africa, places that are landlocked and resource scarce haven't become countries. They become parts of more fortunate countries. Mm-hmm. In Africa, they actually became countries. And the final category of trap is the countries which are small, have little education, and start with very poor economic policies and governments. If we go back 30 or 40 years, many developing countries had very poor economic policies and very poor governance. But the pace of reform away from that configuration was much faster if your country was big population, and if your population was educated. In effect, reform requires or is accelerated by a critical mass of plenty of educated people. And the tiny societies of the bottom billion with very little education just haven't had that critical mass, and so they've stayed stuck with these poor policies, bad governance, for much longer than the other societies.
And as you point out in the book, to the extent there is an educated class, they often leave because they can do so much better elsewhere.
That's right. So that globalization, which has enormously helped a country like China or India, is actually in many ways working against the bottom billion. Globalization means that there are few educated people hemorrhaged to developed countries, and their little bits of wealth are also hemorrhaged in the form of capital flight. Precisely because these countries are stagnant and rather risky, people vote with their wallets, even if they don't vote with their feet. They move their money to America and Europe rather than keeping it in the country.
So let's go back to the conflict issue, which, again, I found quite fascinating. In many of these countries, there are different ethnic groups. We spoke recently in a podcast with Carol Boudreau about Rwanda and some of the horrific problems they've had with ethnic conflict. And you talk about that in quite interesting ways. And what we've learned about this, which is so counterintuitive, what your research has shown, is that the poorer the country is, the more likely it is to be in a cycle of rebellion and counter-rebellion. Now, the standard view would be, I think many people would have the intuition, that poverty is going to reduce rebellion because there's so little to fight over. And yet you show and argue, I think, quite convincingly, that there's a depressing supply side counterweight to that. So talk about that.
Yes, I think there's certainly this statistical regularity that the poorer the society, the slower it's growing, the more likely it is to enter civil war. And in my more recent work, I've consistently found that. So I'm pretty confident about that result. What's driving it is partly, as you say, the supply side, that if people, especially if young men, have no jobs, no income, no prospects, no hope, there's little to stop them being recruited into a rebel group. And so rebel groups find it very easy to attract basically teenage children. Their prospects otherwise are pretty hopeless. So that's the supply side. There's also the fact that in these dirt-poor and stagnant societies, and especially small societies, governments really are not very good at providing security. Governments have an incentive to provide security because they can protect themselves, but they're just not very good at it. They're not resourced to do it. Counterinsurgency is a very skilled, complicated task. I mean, it took both Britain and America a long time to learn the rudiments of it. Quite commonly, in the bottom billion, governments try and repress rebellion extremely incompetently, provoking a lot of outrages, and that fuels the supply of recruits to the rebellion.
But
so I think it works both sides, that you have a supply of people coming into the rebellion, and you have, because it's there is no alternative hope, and you have incompetent and ineffective states that can't protect the society from rebellion.
You speak very cynically of the more standard argument about the causes of this conflict, which is grievance and the so-called root cause being the government's oppressive. And of course, often the government is oppressive, but as you point out, the rebels often just do the same thing. Yes,
I mean, I should say I very much hope I'm not cynical.
Sorry.
There's no room for cynicism in the business of trying to help these countries to prosper. But nor is there room for the sort of wide-eyed naivety that takes a rebel discourse at face value. Of course, rebels are not going to say we're in it for the money. They're going to call themselves the movement for social justice, peace, harmony, love of mankind, and unity. That doesn't mean that's what they're about. I tried to just find out whether the proneness to rebellion could be related to the degree of political repression or other obvious bases for grievance. And I just couldn't find it. It might be there, but I just couldn't find it. What leapt out of the statistics was that proneness to conflict is a matter of poverty and stagnation rather than the sort of grievances that governments you'd think would be incompetently provoking.
So, of course, in these societies then where conflict is common, and ethnic conflict in particular, or other kinds of ideological, whether it's justified or not, conflict is there, and there is a high probability of future conflict, the incentives to invest in the future are very small.
Yes, that's right. So that's a part of the reason why conflict is a trap, because during conflict the economy is destroyed, and even after conflict, the risks of reversion to conflict are so high that investment is bound to be low. Of course, during conflict, there's very little investment. The society is sort of hell-bent on destruction, not construction. And so there's an economic trap coming out of conflict, which is that the society just cannot develop.
Let's turn to the natural resource issue. There's a certain analogy between a natural resource with relatively low extraction cost, such as oil in some places, and aid, foreign aid, whether well-intentioned or not, in that both allow the government to capture resources at a very high surplus, a very relatively low cost, high value. Aid being the cost of receiving aid is maybe the lobbying you do. And in the case of the natural resource, it's the extraction cost or the cost of growing the coffee or the mining the diamonds. Why are they analogous if they are, and why are they so, as you point out, destructive in an unintuitive way, since they should be a good thing?
Well, first of all, I would say that they're not that close an analogy. I mean, there is the analogy you point to. They're both valuable resources accruing to the government that it hasn't had to raise in taxation of citizens. There the analogy ends, and of course, aid is given purposively by the donor community, by aid agencies, and it's directed with a certain sense of purpose. It's on the whole directed towards governments that there's some prospect that they will use it well. It comes along with a lot of advice and capacity building and conditions which try and steer it into good uses, whereas oil and diamonds just bubble out of the ground. So there are many differences as well as that similarity. And as far as I can see, the evidence is that aid is much more effective than the natural resource revenues. The natural resource revenues can be effective. It really depends upon whether the government is a good government or not.
I think, as you point out in the book, the aid there's an enormous temptation. First, I want to distinguish between two kinds of aid, and you can agree or disagree. We've had some very interesting podcasts with Bruce Bueno de Mesquita on the political economy of aid. Putting that to the side for the moment, that you could think of two kinds of aid. One is well-intentioned. It's coming from a development agency. The other is really a part of a nation's foreign policy, trying to achieve something or create an ally or reduce some problem rather than trying to help the citizens in that country. But let's stick with the well-intentioned aid. The problem is, among many, that in these international agencies, one, there's an information challenge. They may not know what's going on in the country as well as they might. But I think you argue in the book that there's a temptation among those agencies, for purely self-interested reasons of the participants, to give aid to countries that are relatively pleasant to visit and hang out in and advise, rather than in the countries where the bottom billion are.
Yes, I mean, I think that's right. I think it's certainly true of the engagement of aid workers that the example I gave was of the World Bank, which is an admirable organization in many ways. I used to work for them for a while, but they have far more staff in the typical middle-income country, large middle-income country, than they do in the societies of the bottom billion. On the whole, staff are reluctant to work in the tough conditions of the bottom billion societies, but that's where they're needed. A few years ago, I went for the World Bank to the Central African Republic, and there wasn't a single resident staff of the World Bank there, nor a single resident staff from the International Monetary Fund in the whole country. And yet the country was desperately short of people with the sort of economic policy competence and skills. So they were crying out for the need for exactly the sort of skills that the organizations like the World Bank and the IMF should be supplying. Instead, all the staff are in China or Indonesia or something, where they're much less needed.
Well, I have good friends at the World Bank, as I know you do as well. And part of their answer would be that they focus on the middle-income countries because they're more likely to be productive, the resources there. But I think there's a little of both going on here. both productivity and a little bit of self-interest as to where it's more pleasant to be.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly wouldn't want... the global organizations have got to stay global for many reasons. But I think the balance of effort and the balance of resources really needs to shift to where the challenge now is, and that's the countries stuck at the bottom.
Well, let's stick with the natural resources then rather than the aid, and talk about why it is that they're so destructive for some nations, but not for others. Certainly, as Botswana is a case that you mentioned, where natural resource wealth, in this case diamonds, has been used relatively well. At the other extreme, you have Norway, which, as you point out, has lots of oil and is thriving. And then you have cases where there are countries with oil or diamonds or coffee or other natural resources that are horrifically poor. What do we know about why those are different?
Yeah, I mean, we know that governance matters enormously. Obviously, these natural resource revenues accrue to governments, and so it's how governments use them that determines whether things end up well or badly. And so what turns out to matter is the initial conditions of governance. As it were, if you get good institutions before you get your oil, which is what happened in Norway, the chances are you'll do fine. If you get your oil before you get your decent institutions, the chances are you never get decent institutions, because the oil revenues and the other natural resource revenues tend to corrode the institutions of governance rather than strengthen them. And so these institutions, which are vital in determining whether public resources are well used or badly used, if they start off bad, they never improve, or it's very hard to get them to improve.
Now,
Some of my friends are struggling to try and do just that in the resource-rich countries of the bottom billion, and it's a struggle.
Well, we're used to that story when the government in these countries is a dictatorship. We understand the intuition of, there's a thug, and the thug uses this flow of wealth from this resource to finance the army, to finance patronage of various kinds. What was interesting to me and what I learned from the book and your research is the problems that democracies have in these poor countries. It's not merely the kleptocratic dictator, but it's also the democracy that doesn't work so well in these poor, very poor countries. Why is that? What goes on there and what goes wrong?
Yes, I think that's been, as it were, the most depressing evidence of the last 15 years or so, is that with the fall of the Soviet Union, we, of course, all hoped that the spread of democracy, which followed from the fall of the Soviet Union, would really lead to dramatically better economic performance, as well as better political rights. And it's tended not to happen. Indeed, in the resource-rich countries, instead of democracy disciplining the governments, the resource revenues have corrupted democracy. And so we get the process that I call the survival of the fattest, the Darwinian struggle amongst politicians in the resource-rich democracies, the Darwinian struggle for votes, but with no checks and balances on how they get those votes. And so they resort to corruption, to patronage, and, of course, as we've seen, to violence. And so instead of democracy forcing governments to adopt good policies in order to win votes, it actually drives them in the other direction. With a dictatorship, at least you might happen to get a decent dictator, although very few bottom billion societies have. But in the resource-rich democracies, unless you start with good checks and balances on how the electoral process is conducted, you get a race to the bottom.
And part of that...
Kenya's not a resource-rich country, but we've just seen that this week. In the absence of effective checks and balances, the incumbent president can win the election without getting the votes.
Yeah, it's very depressing.
All the evidence is that he got fewer votes than his challenger, but he was still able to declare himself the victor in the polls.
Well, just as a digression, I want to come back to the natural resource issue. That kind of corruption, dishonesty, electoral fraud happens in more stable democracies. I always think of Lyndon Johnson's rural Texas vote coming in at the last moment when he needed it to, and that appears to be what's going on in Kenya. You get turnout of 140%. Really, just a wonderfully responsible electorate when they can vote more than once. And yet, in our society, those kind of and in the developed world, those kind of events or embarrassments, here they are just decisively destructive. But on the natural resource issue, one of the ways that it becomes destructive is the way that public spending takes place. Talk about that, the public budget, what government provides with the revenues, even in a democracy.
I mean, that's the heart of the matter, is the opportunity provided by lots of natural resource revenues is to provide a good standard of public goods that benefit the nation. And for that to happen, the winning electoral strategy has to be to offer the nation, as it were, good public goods. What instead you get is an identity politics and a patronage politics in which the winning strategy for a politician is to, as it were, buy a component of votes through patronage, bribery, especially bribery of a few local big shots. And so the national public goods get squeezed out of the system. The public purse becomes what's called a common pool resource, something to be looted. We have the phenomenon of the tragedy of the commons, a resource which nobody regards as their own. And that's what we see with the public purse in these societies. It's the tragedy of the commons, the looting of the public purse by organized political groups, rather than the winning electoral strategy being an appeal to the national vote.
We had a podcast a while back with Bruce Yandel, I recommend to our listeners, on the economics of the tragedy of the commons. But the general phenomenon you're talking about is common with all democratic processes. And the irony, as you point out, is that usually competition would force electoral competitors, politicians, to serve the electorate. And here it seems to work in the opposite direction. The puzzle is, and you say something about this in the book, the puzzle is, that's true in every democracy. In every democracy, there's a temptation to give away parts of the public purse to buy votes that are not very helpful to the general interest and that serve the special interests of key electoral constituencies. We have that in the United States. You have it in the UK. The question is, why is it so destructive in these poor countries? And I think the answer that you give is the role of checks and balances. So talk about that and why. Talk about what's missing and why it leads to that destructive competition.
Yes, I think we've in promoting democracy in the societies of the bottom billion since the end of the Cold War, we've really forgotten what democracy is really about. In a mature democracy really means two things. One is electoral competition. In many ways, that's the easy bit. And the hard bit is the checks and balances which limit how governments can use power. Electoral competition just tells you how governments acquire power, and checks and balances place limits on how they can use that power. Now, electoral competition is frankly dead easy to get established because the incentives for political parties to contest an election are overwhelming. And so you can get elections going in the most unlikely settings of Iraq, Afghanistan, you name it, we can hold an election there. Democratic Republic of the Congo. Checks and balances are a whole different ballgame because they're not events in which parties have a strong incentive to participate. Checks and balances are processes. And what's more, they're a sort of special kind of public good. That is, everybody has some benefit from them. And as with any public good, if everybody benefits, nobody has an incentive to supply them. With checks and balances, it's even worse because the one group that really doesn't benefit from them is the government itself.
Yeah.
And so the government actively opposes the construction of checks and balances. So unless the checks and balances are in place before you get electoral competition, you never get them.
And what are some?
And that's what we've seen playing out is a highly destructive form of electoral competition, destructive precisely because the checks and balances have never been put in place. What we got was, after the end of the Cold War, was instant democracies, and the only aspect of democracy you can do instantly is the elections.
Which has a certain visual and visceral appeal. You can see them, you see the people voting, it makes us feel good. But describe, when you talk about checks and balances, what do you mean precisely? What are some of them?
There are a whole range of checks and balances that a mature democracy has. Quite a few of them are economic. For example, the budgetary process has to be transparent. Citizens have to be able to know how money is being spent. And then there are a lot of constraints indeed on how it's spent. It cannot be embezzled by politicians without that running the risk of it being detected, and if it's detected, it goes before independent courts, which can prosecute the politicians involved. And so there's a process of public scrutiny, which reveals what the budget is about. There's an investigative process which sniffs out corruption and embezzlement, and there's a judicial process which can pass judgment and punish infringements.
And a key part of that, of course, is what we call, without much thought, a free press or free
Absolutely.
media.
So that in addition to the sort of the free press is often called the third estate. So there's the executive and the legislature and a free press, which empowers citizens. So there's a whole host of checks and balances, and indeed, mature democracies have been setting up more and more of them over the last 30 or 40 years. Better systems of informing citizens, better systems of scrutiny, and a more devolved power. For example, the move towards independent central banks in a lot of countries. The bottom billion societies have had none of this.
You give the rather remarkable example of Peru, where on the surface they had a free press, but in fact it was it only looked free.
Peru is a splendid story because it's an event which gets under the skin of the polity, because the government set about corrupting the free press, and in particular it bribed all the newspapers, the radio stations, and the TV stations, except for one TV station which was too small to bother with. And that was the TV station which brought the government down, because it broadcast film of of bribery. And that brought people onto the streets once they saw this film, and that brought the government down. So the Peru story both shows how the government corrupted the media and the enormous amounts of money it was willing to spend doing that, but also how it was right to do so, because the one little bit of the media it failed to fix was the bit that brought it down.
One last question on natural resources. In the beginnings of the Iraq, the aftermath of the military part of the Iraq War, my colleague, Nobel laureate Vernon Smith here at George Mason, argued that for the future of Iraq, what would serve it well would be to disperse the revenue from oil into the hands of the citizens through some kind of stock sharing scheme, and that this would reduce the potential for the natural resource curse that we've been talking about. The Bush administration, I think, considered it. Supposedly they did, and they eventually decided against it on the grounds that the whatever nascent democracy would come out of the post-war era would want those revenues as a form of creating stability. Hasn't worked out that way. We don't know how it'll work out in the next 5 or 10 years, of course, but I think the solution or the potential for privatization of these resources, when it is politically feasible, is a tremendous step in the right direction. Do you agree?
Absolutely. Of course, Iraq's got enormous resources at a more modest level in the typical resource-rich African country. What I've been advocating is school bursaries. So the scheme which Mexico introduced, called the Progressive Scheme, whereby some of the oil revenues are used just to reward children going to school. That's administratively very simple and very effective. It gets money into the hands of ordinary households, and it gets children into school.
And it keeps it out of the hands of folks who would compete for it in destructive ways.
Absolutely.
Let me offer one overview comment, and then I want to turn to the potential, the prescriptions you talk about. It seems that most of these problems ultimately come down to bad governance, not just bad governments, but bad institutions. Either an unstable government, a government that cannot protect property rights, a government that cannot prevent conflict. Without that piece being solved, to me, it doesn't seem there's much that can be done from the outside. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Yes, I think that is fair. I think the problems go beyond bad governance. I think
Agreed.
The landlocked, resource-scarce countries just intrinsically problematic, even where the government is good. There's just not many opportunities. I think small, dirt-poor societies face real logistical problems of insecurity, even where the government is pretty competent. So I think it's not just a matter of bad governance, but I think the move from bad governance to good governance surely helps a lot.
So let me read a lengthy quote, which I think sums up much of what you've been saying, and I think is rather eloquent. And it's about how change in the bottom billion must come from within. And this comes from the preface. Here's what you wrote. Quote, "Unfortunately, it is not just about giving these countries our money. If it were, it would be relatively easy because there are not that many of them. With some important exceptions, aid does not work so well in these environments, at least as it has been provided in the past. Change in the societies at the very bottom must come from within. We cannot impose it on them. In all these societies, there are struggles between brave people wanting change and entrenched interests opposing it. To date, we have largely been bystanders in this struggle. We can do much more to strengthen the hand of the reformers. We can do much more to strengthen the hand of the reformers, but to do so, we will need to draw upon tools such as military interventions, international standard setting, and trade policy that to date have been used for other purposes. The agencies that control these instruments have neither knowledge of nor interest in the problems of the bottom billion. They will need to learn, and governments will need to learn how to coordinate this wide range of policies. End of quote. Now, how might the tools you mentioned, military interventions, international standard setting, and trade policy, make things better?
Okay, well, let's start with some international standards. They sound to be the weakest, superficially, motherhood and apple pie, but they're not. They're vital. I'll give you just a couple of examples there. One is standards for using natural resource revenues. At the moment, there are basically no standards, no international standards. We've got the biggest natural resource revenue bonanza in world history happening right now. Huge amounts of money flowing into the societies of the bottom billion. Last time that happened in the 1970s, it produced no sustained benefit.
This is from the high price of
oil. We've got to make sure that history doesn't repeat itself. International guidelines, even if voluntary, can help the reformers in these societies to rally round a few clear decision points that really matter. For example, are these revenues being saved? Are the processes of investment using the revenues conducted in a fashion which cuts out corruption and which helps to make wise, shrewd investment decisions? Or is it being frittered away on white elephants like last time? So there are a few decision points where international guidelines, even though voluntary, would really be useful to the reformers in these societies. So that's one area.
So
another area is, as we've seen in Kenya just this last week, some international standards on how you conduct elections would be really, really helpful, backed by some enforcement in that case. I think the natural resource guidelines can be entirely voluntary. The guidelines on how we conduct elections really need to be backed up by some sanctions. We just cannot have the sham of presidents claiming to have won elections that they've lost, because the process of these elections, these sham elections, is itself hugely destructive. Look what's happening in Kenya now. And so some international norms, of course we've got international observers, but at the moment we've got no teeth behind those observers. We could use a much stronger enforcement to try and ensure that these elections worked less destructively than they're doing at the moment.
Well, it's a nice idea. I'm worried about the likelihood of that success of that. And as you point out, it's the most modest part of these prescriptions. Make sure that our listeners understand you're talking about just, as you say, international standards that we being experts or outsiders, would develop as guidelines, and it would allow reformers to point to these guidelines when the government was failing to live up to them. So essentially, as I understand it, you're hoping that stigma and shame would help. But in the case of the elections, we have the observers on the ground from the outside, and there's just so much at stake that stigma and shame just go out the window.
Yeah, so, I think in the case of elections, we actually have to back it up with sanctions. In the case of natural resource revenues, we've got good evidence that even voluntary standards can still have effect. There are two pretty new standards, both about 4 or 5 years old. One is called the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which is a voluntary international standard about the reporting of revenues. It's very modest. It just says governments should report to their own citizens what revenues they're getting. The amazing thing is that a lot of governments have now signed up to that. And so that very standard, even though voluntary, is separating the sheep from the goats. The goats are being revealed for what they are. It's also a natural rallying point for reformers in a country to say, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you signing up to this standard? The other similar international standard was the Kimberley process in diamonds, which was about certification of the origin of diamonds. Again, that process, very recent, but has already had a dramatic effect. Every diamond producer in the world is now a part of that system. So there's evidence that even voluntary things can be pretty effective.
Well, as you point out in the book, and I think it's a very elegant example, De Beers, the largest provider of diamonds in the world, was shamed by the publicity around the diamonds, the source of diamonds being just violent and horrifying, because they have an incentive. If people get sufficiently appalled by diamonds, we might actually consider using something else as a way of showing our affection for our spouses, which is one of the strangest emergent customs that there is. But that's the way it is.
From being very fast from being part of the problem to being part of the solution.
So I want to go back to the government case. It would seem to me, and I don't think you talk about this, and I haven't read about it anywhere. It would seem to me that, as you say, it'd be nice if governments would voluntarily sign on. And there's always this issue of causation in these questions. Perhaps the nations that have signed on voluntarily would have been more transparent anyway. But even if that's not the case, even if it has had some effect, what's really driving this is the provision of information. So one way to think about this is that, wouldn't it be nice if, as it was the case in Peru, the evidence of corruption came out because of a little hole in the government's noose around the neck of the media. Somehow there was a little opportunity for escape, and that small station, which hadn't been bribed, revealed what was going on. But in these other situations where natural resources are being used in such a horrifying way, it's nice to think about the possibility that we as outsiders could, at a minimum, provide information about that. One of the things interesting in the book that we haven't talked about, and I think it comes up in this question, is naturally people inside these countries, although often desperate for help from the outside, are also skeptical of the motives and accuracy of the people on the outside, and the governments often use that skepticism to its own advantage, to hide the effects of reform or to make reform look horrifying, and you give some lovely but sad examples of that. So is there any opportunity for providing information, just information, not the standard, not military intervention, but just providing information to these societies that might help them put pressure on their own governments?
Yes, I think there is. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. But the limits, I think, are that in the end, these are internal struggles within these societies. And so the criterion by which we should navigate is always what helps the people who are fighting for change, what helps the beleaguered reformers, and the provision of information for them to use indeed can galvanize the society. When the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative was launched, my friend Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who was then the reforming finance minister in Nigeria, promptly announced, we're going to do that in Nigeria. And she published in the Nigerian newspapers the money that not only was coming in, but that she was passing on to the 36 state governors of Nigeria. And the day she did that in the newspapers, two things happened. One is newspaper circulation hit its all-time high because Nigerian citizens wanted to find out what was happening to that money. Mm-hmm. And the other thing, she got death threats. So she knew she was on the right line. Oh. Reformers in these countries need courage. And the amazing thing is there is a supply of just such people. All we have to do is get behind them a bit more competently than we've been doing to date.
What can we do in the area of trade policy?
Okay, with trade policy, we can do quite a lot. Trade policy, but it's very counterintuitive trade policy. It's the area of economic policy that is kind of least well understood, I think. The countries where our trade policy really matters are the countries which are coastal but resource scarce. I mean, if you're exporting oil, trade policy kind of doesn't matter, at least our trade policy. You can sell your oil anywhere. It's the countries that haven't got the oil, say a country like Kenya, that really needs our help. And what we can do is help it to sort of shoehorn it into the global game. And the global economic game now is especially trade in labor-intensive manufactures, the sort of activities, simple activities which create jobs. Even a country like Bangladesh, which is far from being well run, has created nearly 3 million jobs in textiles, exporting textiles. If Kenya could have 3 million jobs, it would transform the economy. Where our trade policy comes in is that it's hard for a country like Kenya to break in to the market because Asia is already established in the market, and there are scale economies in producing these simple manufactures. And so Asia has lower costs of production than a country like Kenya, not because it pays its workers less, but because it's already got the scale of exports which drive costs down.
The infrastructure and other...
Yeah, that's right. And so paradoxically, what Kenya needs is a phase where it's got a temporary advantage against Asia in our markets. And for that, we just need, as it were, to give preferential access temporarily for a country like Kenya. Now, America's already doing it with something called the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. And that's working very well. It's got its limitations, but even with its limitations, African exports of textiles to America have increased sevenfold in just 5 years. That's big stuff. Europe's got a supposedly similar scheme, and the European scheme is pretty hopeless. It doesn't work.
Why is that?
The devil with all trade policy is in the detail. And the European scheme covers the wrong countries, and it has the wrong restrictions on products. So, for example, Kenya isn't included in the European scheme. Somalia is. If you wanted to set up a textile factory in Somalia and export to Europe, that's just fine, but not Kenya. Unfortunately, not many people do want to set up textile factories in Somalia just at the moment. Of course, right at the moment, they probably don't want to set up in Kenya either.
But as you point out, in the case of Madagascar, which is a very extremely interesting example in the book, the interaction between any of these improvements has to again face the bad governance, bad government issue. So in case of Madagascar, Madagascar was thriving despite the fact that it was a latecomer into the global game. But as I think you described, an election came along where the president decided after he lost, he decided not to step down, blockaded the ports, and the next thing you know, all those jobs disappeared, and they're not coming back for a while. Yeah,
you got it. The president was naturally outraged that the electorate had voted against him, and so, reasonably enough, he blockaded the port for 8 months with his supporters. That, of course, killed the export activities. So the great leader managed to destroy his own economy and 250,000 jobs in the process.
It's very sad. What about agricultural policy? You reference it very briefly, but it's an issue that we've been talking about here on EconTalk, and we're going to talk more about it down the road. But give me your thoughts on what the
Yes,
developed nations...
I tended to underplay agricultural policy in the book, partly because it does get a lot of exposure, and partly because, in a sense, I'd like to see the bottom billion moving on from agriculture a bit. They need to either make natural resources work much better than they've done, or they need to break into manufactures where there are the scope for million upon million of job. But of course, our agricultural policies are somewhere between suspect and disgraceful, depending upon how you look at it. Our agricultural policies are doing a number of damaging things. One is they're subsidizing production in our own societies and closing off the opportunities for production, for competitive export production in the societies of the bottom billion. If you take American cotton, at one stage there was even a proposal that Chad should be persuaded to give up producing cotton, and that can't make sense. There's not much else you can do in Chad, whereas there's lots of other options in America. So the subsidies disadvantage the few export opportunities that some of these countries have got. At the moment, the rather, in my view, crazy policies on stuff like ethanol production, the attempt to sort of turn agriculture into an energy producer, is having dramatic effects on world food prices. And that is very bad news for a lot of societies of the bottom billion, because a lot of these societies are food importers, and for poor people, about half of their income is spent on food. So policies which inadvertently have the effect of slamming up global food prices can be very destructive. They can even become politically very damaging. Just imagine what would happen in America if the price of half of consumption goods suddenly exploded. It would become a political issue.
But the puzzle is, I know it's rather complex. Of course, a lot of the people in these nations are also farmers. It's imaginable that for some of these folks, these higher food prices are making them much better off, as the higher oil prices make the governments better off.
Yes, some farmers are food sellers, but on the whole, the sort of things that farmers tend to sell for export are not food, but they're beverages like coffee, tea, cocoa, sugar. It's that. So the export crops tend not to be the basic foods. A lot of these countries tend to be importers of basic foods.
And expensive corn is very tough on a lot of the world's poor people, which is one of the results of the ethanol push.
I'm sorry, I missed that.
Expensive corn is very hard on people who eat a lot of corn.
Exactly so.
And ethanol production has driven up the price of corn recently. At least that's what they say.
That's the issue I was getting at.
Yeah. Well, we're out of time. Any closing thoughts? Let me give you the following opportunity. You're somewhere, it appears, between Jeffrey Sachs and William Easterly, and you describe this a little bit in your book. Sachs is an optimist about the potential for aid, and Easterly is a pessimist. You're sunnier than Easterly, but you're not as sunny as Sachs. Make the case for being optimistic over the next 10, 20 years. You've described some prescriptions. Some of them may help. Some of them may not end up working, of course. Do you see a better future for the bottom billion over the next 20 years?
Yes, I do. I think first of all, I don't want to be sort of positioned in Bill and Jeff spectrum.
Sorry about that. That's a cheap shot.
I think the message of the bottom billion is there are a lot of instruments beyond aid that will be very effective, and so this aid debate is, in a way, a bit of a sideshow, a bit of a diversion. The bottom billion have got to succeed. We can be part of that success. They've got to succeed because the prospect of 1 billion people continuing to diverge from the rest of mankind is frankly unthinkable. Over the course of the next 20 years, there's a lot that we can do in our societies to increase the chances that the people struggling for change within these societies will win their struggle. We've just got to get more serious about it. Let me close with what America did last time it got serious about a major development problem, and that was the development of Europe after the Second World War. America knew it had to recover the European economy and European society because the alternative was that these societies would tumble into the auspices of the Soviet Union. And America did get serious. It changed its trade policy from protectionism to openness to European markets and European products. It changed its security policy from isolationism to putting 100,000 troops in Europe for 40 years. It changed its governance attitudes from saying, we don't interfere with you, you don't interfere with us, to systems of mutual governance, such as the OECD and the encouragement of the European community, as well as a big aid program, Marshall Aid. We've got to do all four of those things. At the moment, we're not facing the reality of the enormity of the problem. The analogy is not what we did in the Second World War, after the Second World War. It's what we failed to do after the First. After the Second World War, the risks were blindingly, obviously, in America's face. Very soon after the Second World War, there were nuclear rockets aimed at you. After the First World War, the risks were there, but they were amorphous, and so they were never faced. That Paris Peace Conference of 1919 ended in failure to address the issues, and 20 years later, it all blew up. And so we've got to get serious about these risks. If we do get serious, of course the problem is fixable, and of course in 20 years' time, the societies of the bottom billion will look very different from now.
Well,
but it's in our hands.
I hope you're right. My guest today has been Paul Collier, professor of economics at Oxford University and the author of The Bottom Billion. Paul, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thanks very much indeed.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.